On an early September morning in the decade, shrill screams suddenly broke the silence in one of the quietest neighborhoods in Bristol. Neighbors immediately looked out their windows and saw a young man standing in the street wearing only his underwear. His skin looked as if it was covered in some kind of dirt. But when the neighbors went outside to help the strange man, it turned out that the dark substance was his skin. It was literally peeling off in shreds as he just stood there begging for help. Clearly, the young man was in unimaginable pain, and despite the efforts of his neighbors, there was little they could do to help him at that time. Luckily, there was no traffic jam in the city at the time, and the first ambulance was on the scene within minutes. The arriving paramedics were undoubtedly astonished by how severe and distressing the man's physical condition was. But this was only the beginning of this cruel case, which over time showed the horrific depths to which human cruelty can lead. In this video, I will tell you about the incredibly tragic case of Mark van Dongen, a young and talented engineer whose life took the darkest turn shortly after he attempted to end his toxic relationship. Mark van Dongen was a Dutch citizen. Mark's father, Kees van Dongen, described him as an extremely empathetic person, always characterized by care, kindness, and compassion. Even as a little boy, Mark constantly showed empathy toward his peers and returned toys that he had won through fair play. He simply didn't want them to be upset. In college, Mark studied civil engineering. It is safe to say that he was one of the most successful students in his degree program. This was not surprising, as he had always been an ambitious young man. To put it simply, Mark wanted to be successful both in his studies and in his professional life. After completing his studies in the Netherlands, he moved to Bristol in the United Kingdom to continue his education and find a job in his field. Moving to another country was indeed the start of a new chapter in the young man's life. At that time, Mark met Berlinah Wallace-Kennan, a fashion student from South Africa who was nearly 20 years older than him. According to reports, Mark and Berlinah started dating in 2010. In the beginning, their relationship looked promising. At least, they quickly became close and started living together. Without a doubt, Mark was very invested in their relationship, supporting Berlinah both emotionally and financially. Over time, however, they had their first serious problems. To put it simply, Berlinah began to show herself as an emotionally unstable and controlling woman with many complexes. As a result, their relationship began to worry Mark's friends and relatives. This was completely normal, as they often had to observe how Berlinah manipulated his emotions and constantly had tantrums. Furthermore, they had seen visible signs of the woman's physical aggression on Mark's body, and had even learned that Berlinah had once poured boiling water over him while he was sleeping. But despite these incidents, Mark somehow remained in a relationship with Berlinah, and as far as I know, it lasted about 5 years. In August 2015, however, his patience had run out, and he decided to break up with the woman. Looking for something new, Mark met another woman named Violet Farquharson, and soon after they began a romantic relationship. Nevertheless, Berlinah did not want to let Mark go. She literally flooded him with messages, trying to instill guilt in him and also threatening him with reprisals. However, he always tried to remain calm and did not respond to the threats against him. Additionally, Mark continued to support the woman financially even after they had officially broken up. But for some reason, that didn't suit her, and eventually her jealousy turned into obsession. In other words, Berlinah began stalking Mark and harassing his new affair with silent phone calls. At that time, he often told his friends that he was afraid of Berlinah, and it must be said that after her threats to harm herself, his fears only grew stronger. According to one of his closest friends, she even threatened to injure herself and then make it look like he had done it. At the same time, despite his fear, Mark felt somewhat obliged to visit Berlinah regularly to ensure mutual well-being. In September 2015, Mark made another attempt to end the relationship once and for all and visited Berlinah's apartment one last time. Shortly after he entered the apartment, the conversation devolved into an argument. The woman again refused to acknowledge that he had left her and clung to the relationship despite his regular attempts to end it. According to sources, Berlinah told Mark that day that she would spend the night in a hotel. He, for his part, decided to stay overnight in her apartment for some reason. Around 3 a.m., when Mark was already asleep, Berlinah returned home. Shortly thereafter, she went into the bedroom and woke Mark, saying, "If I can't have him, no one else will." And before he could react to those words, Berlinah spat acid directly into his face. In a fraction of a second, the liquid struck Mark's skin. He literally screamed in pain and leaped out of bed in agony. Mark, who could barely see, went outside and shouted for help, waking most of the neighbors, who immediately rushed to their windows. At first, they thought it was a prank or something similar. One of the neighbors even thought the commotion was caused by the howling of a fox that had wandered into the residential area. After a few minutes, however, it became clear what had actually happened. While waiting for the ambulance, the neighbors took Mark into the apartment and poured cold water over him to alleviate his suffering. But despite their efforts, his body had already sustained enormous damage. When the paramedics arrived on the scene, Mark was foaming at the mouth. Moreover, he was blinded and still in severe pain. There was no doubt among all specialists that the damage to Mark's body was simply catastrophic. His face and upper body were covered in deep burns, and the acid was still eating through his skin and muscle tissue. Despite his agony, Mark managed to report who had attacked him. He also asked the paramedics to check on his new girlfriend, as she might have also been attacked by Berlinah. But that was not the case, because the attacker was still in the apartment, sitting calmly on the bed. She was likely completely unaffected by Mark's piercing screams echoing through the neighborhood. Instead of calling for help, Berlinah simply grabbed the phone and called a close friend, showing no signs of remorse. Fortunately for Mark, the paramedics worked very quickly. They administered oxygen and painkillers to combat his breathing problems and somewhat stabilize his condition. While the young man was being transported to the hospital, the first police officers had already arrived at the scene. They quickly questioned the neighbors, who confirmed that he had identified Berlinah as his attacker. These observations, combined with Mark's account to the doctors and neighbors, were finally reason enough to act swiftly. When police officers entered Berlinah's apartment, she was still sitting on the bed, showing no visible signs of anxiety. And despite the chaos unfolding right outside her door, she remained unconcerned and did not even think of offering assistance to the man she had just attacked. Be that as it may, the officers noted her detached behavior and took her into custody on suspicion of grievous bodily harm. After the woman's arrest, investigations continued in her apartment to gather possible evidence and other information. The police managed to find a used acid bottle that no longer had the original label attached. This circumstance suggested that Berlinah deliberately wanted to conceal the contents from the public. During the initial interrogation, the woman claimed she did not know that the bottle contained acid and not plain water. Meanwhile, doctors had already determined that the burns covered about 25% of Mark's body. At the same time, his left leg, which already showed signs of circulatory collapse, was a serious problem. It was clear to all specialists that they were dealing with a victim of one of the worst acid attacks they had ever experienced. And since the young man's condition was deteriorating relentlessly, he had to be transferred to the intensive care unit and placed in an induced coma. Meanwhile, the police continued their investigation. They found that Berlinah had been preparing the attack for weeks. Investigators also spoke with Mark's relatives, all of whom reported Berlinah's emotionally unstable and manipulative behavior toward him. They specifically mentioned a series of events that occurred in the final months of their relationship, including the boiling water incident. Overall, Mark's relatives described their relationship as a growing escalation of physical aggression that culminated in this brutal attack. Furthermore, investigators collected compelling evidence that Berlinah had sought therapists and admitted to them that she had serious issues with anger control. During her last visit with a therapist, Berlinah reportedly stated that she gets an incredible adrenaline rush when someone disagrees with her. Sometime later, the fact that she had purchased acid became known. It turned out that the woman had simply ordered it on Amazon. After receiving a container of 98% concentrated sulfuric acid, Berlinah deliberately removed the label which stated that the acid causes severe burns and other serious damage upon skin contact. Investigators believe the woman did this to prevent Mark or other people from discovering the colorless substance and recognizing it as sulfuric acid. It is also important that the examination of Berlinah's electronic devices revealed that the choice of sulfuric acid itself was not random. In the weeks leading up to the actual attack, she conducted more than 80 search queries regarding various manufacturers of sulfuric acid. Furthermore, she visited dozens of online resources and read hundreds of reports about the physical damage and long-term effects on the human body suffered by victims of such attacks. There is no doubt that the volume of data from her research led to the conclusion that the attack was not impulsive. The fact that the woman did not make a single attempt to help the young man or call an ambulance is further evidence of this. At the same time, she harbored no doubt that the acid had worked, inflicting the worst possible injuries on Mark. As mentioned earlier, Berlinah simply sat on her bed, feeling satisfied and showing complete indifference. And honestly, that is truly astonishing. How could one ignore the suffering of a person close to them who is literally writhing in pain? To return to Mark, after he was placed in an induced coma, he spent about 4 months in the intensive care unit. And when the young man woke up, the extent of his injuries was still clearly visible. As a result of neuropathy stemming from muscle mass loss, Mark was paralyzed from the neck down to his toes. Essentially, he could not move anything except his tongue. The acid had eaten so deeply into the lower part of his left leg that amputation was the only way to prevent further complications. Despite the specialists' efforts to save most of the limb, the damage was too great and the leg had to be removed up to the knee. Furthermore, the acid also burned Mark's face, leaving him partially blinded and severely disfigured. When the young man first saw his new reflection, he was literally devastated. And despite the support of his father, his friends, and the medical staff, Mark understandably had emotional difficulty accepting reality. It is also important to mention that at that time, he communicated only with the help of a letterboard, pointing to the correct letters with his tongue. While this was a truly grueling process, it was the only way to express his thoughts. In any case, the loss of his former way of life, coupled with the constant and relentless physical pain, plunged Mark into the deepest depression of his life. Of course, credit must be given to his father, who tried to be there for him as often as possible and ensure he stayed in good spirits. In November 2016, the young man was transferred to a boarding facility in the city of Gloucester. However, the conditions there were deplorable. Mark's father had to drive around 1,300 kilometers to visit his son and often found him lying in his own feces. This was undoubtedly a heartbreaking sight, and so he resolved to get him out of there at any cost. Later, Mark was indeed moved to another boarding facility in Belgium, but his suffering continued there as well. Of course, the medical staff tried their best to improve the young man's living conditions, but they simply did not have the experience or equipment to treat and care for people with injuries as severe as Mark's. And despite all the progress he made, such as being able to whisper, the young man still questioned the meaning of such a life. Sometime later, Mark's condition worsened again because he had developed a severe lung infection. It required a tracheotomy, a common surgical procedure where the windpipe is cut open so the patient can breathe normally. Of course, this operation could save Mark's life, but it would also take away his ability to whisper. And that was a small but crucial impetus for his ability to communicate with his father. Ultimately, it was something like a final blow for Mark. Given the paralysis, the unbearable pain, and the silence, he told his father that he no longer wanted to fight for his life. With the support of his family members, Mark applied to the Belgian government for what is known as voluntary euthanasia, which was approved under certain conditions. His application was reviewed by 3 different authorities, and all confirmed that he was enduring unbearable suffering. Thus, Mark spent the final minutes of his life on January 2, 2017, together with his father, whom he had personally asked to stay with him until the end. The trial against Berlinah Wallace did not begin until April 2018, almost 3 years after her attack. By this time, the woman had still not pleaded guilty and continued to insist that she did not know she was pouring acid on Mark. However, upon closer inspection of the case, her story immediately collapsed. The prosecution presented extremely compelling evidence that her attack was malicious and carefully planned. For example, they detailed the moment Berlinah purchased the bottle of concentrated sulfuric acid, as well as the deliberate removal of the label. Furthermore, they stated that the woman had repeatedly searched for information about sulfuric acid attacks. In their opinion, Berlinah not only wanted to harm Mark, but also to ensure that no woman would ever want to be with him again. Numerous witnesses also described Berlinah's controlling and aggressive behavior, painting an overall picture of their toxic relationship. Above all, the prosecution argued that the woman's actions were the direct cause of the young man's death. Therefore, a murder charge was presented to the jury. However, since Mark's life had been ended by voluntary euthanasia, the jury had to decide whether Berlinah's actions were the primary cause of his death or whether other factors contributed. To general surprise, the jury could not determine that the woman's actions met the requirements of murder law. In other words, they did not find her guilty of committing either simple murder or manslaughter. However, they did find her guilty of the deliberate use of a corrosive substance with the intent to cause grievous bodily harm, a serious charge that also carried a high penalty. During the sentencing, the judge delivered a rather poignant speech that highlighted the recklessness of Berlinah's act and the immense pain she inflicted on Mark and his family. Here is the approximate content of the speech. On September 2, 2015, you purchased 1 liter of 98% concentrated sulfuric acid. You intended to attack Mark Van Dongen with it because you wanted him to leave another woman for you. Previously, you removed the label, stating that the acid causes severe burns and other serious injuries. You did this to prevent the acid from being found in your apartment. You chose the timing of the attack in advance. It came when Mark Van Dongen was sleeping in the bed you once shared with him in your apartment, wearing only his underwear. Because he was asleep, vulnerable, and virtually naked, he had no real way to escape your attack and protect his face and body. The burns Mark suffered covered 2/3 of his face and most of the top of his chest, as well as his arms and thighs. They affected about 25% of his body surface area. The subsequent skin graft and the one following that covered over 4% of Mark's total body surface area. The treating burn surgeon said he had never had a patient with such severe injuries caused by a sulfuric acid attack. In total, Mark spent about 11 months in the intensive care unit. During this time, he had to undergo numerous surgical procedures. His left leg had to be amputated. He completely lost vision in his left eye and almost completely lost it in his right eye. Doctors used the strongest painkillers, which in turn caused severe side effects and complications. Mark was unable to communicate for 4 months. He suffered not only severe burns, but also damage to a number of vital bodily systems. During his time in the intensive care unit, he suffered from recurring chest infections and septic shock. Mark's kidneys were damaged. He had severe bowel problems. His heart rate and liver function were also impaired. When he was discharged from the hospital in November 2016, he was paralyzed from the neck down to his toes. His upper arms and legs were immobile. Had Mark chosen to continue fighting, he would have required further surgery and meticulous care. Mark's other treating doctor said that his appearance could not be restored. This meant that he was permanently and irrevocably disfigured. The scarring on his face was classified as the most severe. In view of all these circumstances, Berlinah Wallace was sentenced to 12 years in prison. This verdict naturally triggered mixed reactions in society. Many people, including Mark's family members, felt that this sentence was not harsh enough given the extent of his suffering. The case also sparked a loud public debate about the possibility of using sulfuric acid as a weapon. This led to an upcoming discussion about stricter regulations for the sale of such substances and higher penalties for offenses related to them. Subsequently, the increased attention to the case also contributed to the adoption of new legislation regarding so-called offensive weapons. Thanks to this law, new age restrictions were introduced for the purchase of corrosive substances. At the same time, many retailers destroyed their internal guidelines to limit the sale of dangerous chemicals in this manner. Following the verdict, Mark van Dongen's family members struggled with their grief for a long time. As far as I know, the young man's younger brother set up a special crowdfunding page to raise money and support his father, whose previous financial stability had suffered. On the page, the young man described how his father traveled to and from Bristol for months, sleeping in his car in the hospital parking lot to save money. He also spoke of Mark's unbearable suffering, such as paralysis, the loss of a leg, an eye, and an ear, and how the constant pain drove him mad. As for Berlinah Wallace, she immediately began serving her sentence in a British prison. Unfortunately, due to internal confidentiality rules related to the law regarding the placement of prisoners, no exact information was disclosed about which prison she was sent to. I can only say that she will be eligible for parole for the first time in 2027. However, the decision regarding Berlinah's future fate will depend on her behavior and other not insignificant factors assessed by a special parole board. In his public statements, Mark's father, Kees van Dongen, expressed his hope that she would have to fight for this decision in her favor. Overall, the statement reflected the conviction of Mark's family that Berlinah's actions deserved a harsher punishment. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourselves.